In the NFC Championship and the Super Bowl, the Philadelphia Eagles would go on to score a combined 95 points. They are, of course, your Super Bowl champions for the 2024-25 season. But the manner in which they did so, whether it was a dominant showing in the biggest game of the season or the way that they have been playing all year, it has been a special season for the Philadelphia Eagles, and one that could have a lot of ripple effects and a lot of implications for the entirety of the NFL. Welcome back to State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts, and today we're talking about how the Eagles won Super Bowl LIX. Let's start off logically here with the Super Bowl MVP in Jalen Hurts. This is a quarterback who, rightfully so, has experienced some criticism in the past and some detractors. You look at the tail end of last season, and his turnovers were really costing the team some games. And overall, as a passer, he is very far from, the most poised and accurate quarterback in the entire NFL. And early on in his career, I believe it was his first season starting officially the entire year for the Eagles, where he led them to the playoffs with about a 9-8 record, and they were a first round exit. And he did not have a good performance. And so, from his very first playoff showing, there was a little bit of a narrative growing that Jalen Hurts was not a big game guy, because this season, where he just started, he was the guy they just traded away. They got rid of Carson Wentz, and Hurts is the guy now, so the expectations are on you. And that year, he goes on to throw for 16 touchdowns throughout the entire season. And there were certainly some positives to be taken away, but overall, it wasn't one that looked to really get the ball rolling. And that continued into the playoffs, where people, after his very lackluster performance, they didn't want to really give him the benefit of the doubt, some leniency, just because of the fact that we hadn't seen a lot from him in the regular season. But the Eagles trust in their guy, and they eventually managed to build this great roster around him. A couple years ago, they go to the Super Bowl against the Kansas City Chiefs. And in that game, Jalen Hurts really flips the narrative. There is one costly fumble that he had, but other than that, that is one of the better Super Bowl performances that we've ever seen from a quarterback. And of course, they go on to narrowly lose that game. And 2 years later, they get their revenge. And that was certainly a date that they are going to remember, because I think that loss really instilled something in them. When you first make it to the Super Bowl, especially a young quarterback like Jalen Hurts, you may kind of be a little bit wrapped up in the moment, all the bright lights. Or even we can go back to his first ever playoff game. That may be a little bit daunting, especially as a younger quarterback that is just really trying to get his footing in the league and solidify himself as the starter for this team. So in year one starting, it was just that first playoff game entirely where the lights were a little bit bright. And then he comes back with a vengeance. And not too long after, they make the Super Bowl. And he has a great performance, but it's one costly turnover that, in a game where most possessions seemed to end in a score, really could have decided the outcome of it. But 2 years later, here they are back in the Super Bowl facing Kansas City. And all of a sudden, whether it was the NFC Championship or the Super Bowl itself, Jalen Hurts was playing some of the best football that he has ever played. And statistically, you can maybe look at regular season games or even maybe some postseason showings that might have statistically better production, like that Super Bowl loss. However, in these last two games, Jalen Hurts has really solidified himself in his role with this team. Because all year, of course, this has been Saquon Barkley's team. And of course, the Philadelphia Eagles have been run-oriented under Jalen Hurts. However, they never had someone of the caliber of Saquon. And so to bring him into your offense, that's an entirely new element that you have to adapt to. And this season, he didn't throw a lot of turnovers. He had 6 picks the entire regular season. and his completion percentage was very, very high. However, this was also a year where, kind of in contrast to that completion percentage, he wasn't always uber efficient at moving the ball down the field. It seemed like some of those costly turnovers that he had in years past was really kind of weighing on him. And there were multiple times this season where he would sit back in the pocket for quite a long time. And typically, that's not a good sign. But with it, at least, you kind of hope for a big play down the field, just waiting on someone to get open. But so often, that would just end up being an incompletion, or Jalen Hurts would roll out right and just throw the ball out of bounds, or get maybe a 1 yard gain on the ground. He was indecisive so often at times. And his completion percentage was up, his touchdown to interception ratio was up, but he did not look as decisive or as confident as he had previously been. But these last two games, by that standard, have been some of the best of his career. He's held that high completion percentage, and he's able to play more within the flow of the offense and actually be able to be a productive, efficient quarterback. You look at the first two games of this playoff run for the Eagles and the last two, and it's a stark contrast, particularly in regards to his production. And what we've seen from this is the evolution of Jalen Hurts in real time as a big game player and someone that at this point is not afraid of the big moment, is ready to step up when needed, as we just saw with him winning Super Bowl MVP. And when you bring him down, whether it's his first playoff exit, whether it's the Super Bowl loss, he comes back better than ever. So all the love and appreciation for the Super Bowl MVP goes out to Jalen Hurts. But there are definitely some more key pieces to this dynamic, explosive offense. So how about that addition to the team that might have taken Hurts a little while to really develop chemistry with and learn to play alongside? That is, of course, Saquon Barkley, who just had one of the best, maybe the most complete season that we've ever seen from an NFL running back. When you count the regular season and postseason, he had the most rushing yards that any player has had in the season in the entire history of the NFL, in a league that is slowly but decisively trending towards a more pass-oriented game plan for a lot of teams. And Saquon was a shining example of that mindset. The Giants moved off of him to, to pay Daniel Jones, who's not even on the team anymore. The best player that the Giants have had in years, and they let him go. He's a running back. They don't want to pay him. And the Eagles take a chance on him. He has not just the best season of his entire career, but one of the best seasons that we've ever seen from a running back. In the modern NFL, the MVP is without a doubt a quarterback award. But if we're talking about true value to a team, I don't know that there's anyone more valuable in the league than Saquon Barkley. And let's talk about his playoff run now. Because for the first 3 games, it was breakaway run after breakaway run, and no one could even contain Saquon Barkley, much less stop him. It's impossible to stop number 26, but you've at least got to try to contain him. In this entire regular season, and this playoff run up into the Super Bowl, that was seemingly an impossible task. And in this Super Bowl, it was very evident that the Chiefs were focusing a lot of attention on Saquon Barkley. And this is a team, a defense in particular, with some really good rushers in Karlaftis and Chris Jones, as well as a great linebacking trio led by Nick Bolton and Tranquil. And they were prepared to do everything that they could to stop the run and stop Saquon Barkley. And with that, they believed that that would shift the game in their favor. And they focused in so much on Saquon Barkley that they almost forgot that they were playing an all-pro wide receiver and one of the best number 2 wide receivers in the entire league. And that's really the value of the running back in the modern NFL. Because as we have seen the rise of passing offenses and the success that they've had, whether it's the Patriots dynasty, whether it's the Chiefs, Teams follow the winners, and that's just a thing in every league. People are going to try to replicate what the championship team is doing because obviously they're doing something right. And so the league more and more so is shifting towards most offenses focusing on the pass. You look at the conference championships on both sides. You had the Chiefs and the Bills in the AFC, both very pass-focused teams, led by some of, if not the two best quarterbacks in the entire NFL. And then on the other side, in the NFC, you have the Washington Commanders, who, as a unit, a lot of that rushing offense is to the credit of Jaden Daniels, their rookie quarterback. So that offense is also very well run through the quarterback. But then, as a true outlier, you have the Philadelphia Eagles. And yes, they certainly get their quarterback involved in the run game as well. But that bread and butter, their number one guy, that is, of course, Saquon Barkley. And the league isn't going to shift towards 20 teams being run focused at this point. Even kids growing up, kids coming in, whether it's this draft or future ones, the idea, the dream at the end of the day is always kind of to be, the quarterback for whatever team. Back in the day, those were the Dallas Cowboys. Not so anymore. But it's always the quarterback position that a kid might dream of more than anything else. And over time, it's just become more and more prestigious. The greatest player of all time, Tom Brady, is, of course, a quarterback. And things are truly only going to stay that way or continue to progress that way. But you're never going to be able to fully take the running back out. And that's because of a team like the Philadelphia Eagles. And even the Baltimore Ravens with Derrick Henry. These are two teams that took on aging running backs that were kind of given up on by their former franchises and instilled a lot of their trust in them to be able to lead this team and be very key contributors, if not the focal point of the offense. And Derrick Henry rushes for 1,900 yards. Saquon becomes the 9th player in NFL history to run for 2,000. And it just opens up their offense to a completely different level. You look at the Buffalo Bills, who I spoke of earlier, of course the focus is on Josh Allen. But you get a 1,000-yard rusher in there in James Cook, and all of a sudden, Allen, this guy who was seen as a little bit turnover prone, a little bit of a turnover machine, that was always the biggest detriment to him. Guess what? He gets a 1,000-yard rusher in James Cook. He's an MVP player. Running backs can be very, very valuable to your team as the first option. However, in the modern NFL, where we focus more and more on the pass, there's another role for them where they can be just as much of a factor, and we really saw this in the Super Bowl. And that is in the fact that they can open up an entirely different dimension to your offense. Because, as I mentioned, the Kansas City Chiefs, they were locked in on Saquon Barkley. They were not going to let him go out here and dominate like he had the entire season, the entire postseason run. And for the most part, they really held him in check. There was no big Saquon Barkley 60-yard breakaway touchdown, and there weren't really a lot of even 4-yard gains. He averaged only 2.3 yards a carry. But in spite of that, he carried the ball 25 times. That's more times than Jalen Hurts threw the ball the entire game, the Super Bowl MVP. And Saquon, on the other hand, he had a quiet game. Why is that? And that's because when a team has to respect the run so much, that opens up your passing game. And as teams shift more and more towards making passing a focal point, the focal point of their offense, this is so often lost. But because the Kansas City Chiefs were putting so much attention on Saquon Barkley, that allowed Jalen Hurts to move the ball downfield as well as he ever has and deliver the ball to his top guys, and especially Devonta Smith, who had a great performance this Super Bowl. So even if he didn't have a big impact in terms of proper production, especially in regards to what you might expect from a guy like Saquon Barkley, he still managed to be a key factor because of how much he was a focal point of the Chiefs' game plan in stopping him, and that allowed everything else in the offense to flow as well as it ever has. And that's where you really see the value of the modern running back and continuing to give them chances to show out like Saquon did this season. Because as we shift more and more towards the passing game, teams are going to pick up very talented quarterbacks. They're going to surround them with good wide receivers for the most part. But you don't want that to be everything for your offense because passing in itself can be very, very volatile. By its very nature, in regards to a fumble versus an interception, when a guy's running the ball, he is more likely than not going to fumble it by himself. You're going to have to actively try to strip the ball away from him. But when you're throwing the ball, sometimes all it takes is a bad read from the quarterback or a wide receiver that can't create any separation. And say the wide receiver does catch the ball, guess what? That opens up the door for a fumble. So by their very nature, there is more potential for a turnover in a pass than there is in a run. And so as we see teams focus more and more on the passing attack, there's still a lot of efficiency to be found and a lot of stability to be found in the run game. You even think of the yards per carry for a running back. And so often when we're talking about moving the ball downfield and why offenses focus on the pass, a lot of it comes down to even the best running backs in the NFL, their yards per carry, that's comparable with some of the worst quarterbacks in the league's yards per attempt. However, that yards per attempt from the quarterback is not a good example, a good showing of what you're getting per play from that person. Because with most quarterbacks, you want to aim around that 65% completion mark. And yes, every time he drops back, he might average 7 yards per attempt, 8 yards per attempt. But a lot of the time, he might not hit on that ball, and that's okay. Defenses are game planned to stop you from doing just that. And so we might have a 10-yard throw one play and then an incompletion the next. You're not getting that on a down-to-down basis. But with a running back, it can be a lot more consistent. There's, of course, not a completion percentage handing the ball off to your running back. So their carries are true carries, as opposed to attempts and dealing with completions and incompletions. So you look at a guy like Saquon Barkley, well over 5 yards a carry this year. And on a down-to-down basis, you could always count on him to make a pretty solid gain. And it wasn't always a Saquon breakaway touchdown, but just little 5-yard gains here and there. That's huge for the efficiency and the stability of an offense to consistently move it down the field. And so even though Saquon Barkley didn't have a big night in the Super Bowl, he was still a key factor because of all of his impact on the Philadelphia Eagles. And I hope I was really able to exemplify that here. And one last example here is the Tom Brady-led Buccaneers. Because in Tom Brady's second to last season in the NFL, he set the record for completions. He threw for over 5,000 yards and over 40 touchdowns. And the year prior, they had won the Super Bowl. But this year, there was not much of a run game to respect. Now, I love Rachaad White. I think he's a great receiving back, but as a running threat, he really hasn't shown much in the NFL. And ultimately, unlike the year prior, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers did not end that year with a ring because teams were able to focus and key in on the passing game. That was really the only option where the Buccaneers could really hurt you because they didn't have that consistency as well as a big play threat in the run game. And both those two things are very, very crucial and something that a running back can provide. And both those are what Saquon really provided for this team. And then, of course, what makes this offense go around besides the skill position players, and that is the offensive line. This is, for my money, the best offensive line in all of professional football. Lane Johnson is a first ballot Hall of Famer and one of the better linemen that we've ever seen. And you could have a great running back, you could have a great quarterback, but if they've got no time to throw, if the running back can't find any holes, your offense is going to be severely limited because you're not putting your uber talented players in the best position to succeed. You look at the line for this team the entire season, they've been so vital to what the Philadelphia Eagles do. I spoke of Jalen Hurts and his indecisiveness at times this season, but guess who allowed him to sit back there in the pocket for long periods of time? Allowed him to sit back and try to make a play when so many other quarterbacks, they might only have 2 seconds to get the ball out and have to constantly be wary of pressure from the defense. This line allowed Hurts to, even if so many of these plays didn't end up in a positive gain, they gave Jalen Hurts time. And if they hadn't done that, it could have very well been a sack if this was any other O-line in the league. And it allowed Jalen Hurts to, even when he's at his worst, when he's taking too long to make a play, not being very decisive throwing the ball, it allowed Hurts to not drag down this offense and still be a very, very good quarterback, a very efficient, stable quarterback at the very least, in spite of his flaws, because of the way this O-line was able to hold up for him. And then, of course, you have running back Saquon Barkley. You don't rush for 2,000 yards with a bad offensive line. It seemed like every week there was some Saquon Barkley breakaway touchdown, gets away from the defense for not just a big gain, but a score. 6 points on the board for the Philadelphia Eagles. And credit to Saquon, a lot of that can be self-made. You know, you get a little bit down the field, and it's just you and the defense from that point on. However, in initiating the run, the offensive line is the most important because these are the guys that create the initial holes, create the gaps for the running back to get any kind of gain. And even Saquon Barkley has acknowledged he would not have been able to have the year that he had if it wasn't for the way that this Philadelphia Eagles offensive line allowed him to. And they really allowed this entire offense to flourish and function to the best of their ability. And especially, we also see that in the Super Bowl, where it was in stark contrast to the offense for the Kansas City Chiefs. And for KC, it seemed like Patrick Mahomes was running for his life from the Eagles' pass rush the entire game. And in terms of design plays from the Eagles' defense, they did not blitz once. And that offensive line was still struggling to hold up. And Patrick Mahomes, as we've seen so often, he can have major highlight plays through improvising. But you can't rely on that forever, and that certainly didn't work out for them this game. And these two O-lines on both sides, so often it's a position, they just don't get their flowers. But I think this Super Bowl really showed how important that position can be. They allow everything in the offense to function smoothly. And without it, you get something like the Chiefs' performance. And then one last player I want to mention here is Devonta Smith, as well as A.J. Brown, I guess. And that is just a trend in the NFL that I'm kind of noticing with wide receiver duos. Now, this is a position that is consistently one where these players are labeled divas. If they're unhappy with the situation, they want more money, whatever it might be. And so often that leads to overconfident guys who want to definitively be the number one option on their team and be the wide receiver for their franchise. However, when you've only got one guy as your true threat as a receiver, then defenses are really able to focus on that. And if they're able to focus on that, that can shut down a lot of the passing game. But when you have two uber talented wide receivers, in this case, of course, being A.J. Brown, all-pro wide receiver this year, and Devonta Smith, who had an amazing Super Bowl performance, all of a sudden you've got threats on both sides of the field. You can't make your defensive backs focus on one area of the field. You got to focus on both the left and right side. And say you have one lockdown corner against one star wide receiver, that corner is going to, at the very least, make life a little bit tougher for that wide receiver. But when you've got maybe one lockdown corner in Trent McDuffie against two stellar wide receivers, it's a whole different ball game. And it becomes a lot harder to cover and contain those receivers. And A.J. Brown didn't really have a very impressive postseason run. And with that, if they hadn't had a true great wide receiver threat to go to, that could have made this passing offense a lot more of a struggle to get through. But they were able to go to Devonta Smith as well as Dallas Goedert, who is a very good tight end for this team. And that allowed this offense, this passing game, to really continue to flow, even if A.J. Brown wasn't having the best games of his career. So credit to this entire Eagles offense, from Super Bowl MVP, QB1, Jalen Hurts, to Saquon 2K, to the great wide receiver duo, to the offensive line, and also Dallas Goedert at that tight end position, being perhaps the Eagles' most reliable receiving threat this entire postseason run. As good as this offense is, there's still another very key part to this team, and that is, of course, their defense. And this is perhaps the best defensive unit in the entire NFL, and we really saw that this game. As I mentioned earlier, talking about the O-linemen, Mahomes was under pressure a lot this game. And in terms of design plays, because some of them, Zack Baun would switch into a little bit more of a pass rushing role, but they had no design blitzes. The Eagles never had a design blitz this game, and they were still able to pressure Patrick Mahomes. And that's because of the line with guys like Jordan Davis, stud, young defensive tackle Jalen Carter, and the returning Brandon Graham, who might just be going out with a Super Bowl win. If we're talking about how defense wins championships, that starts in the trenches, because that sets the tone for the rest of the defense and also what this offense is going to have to go up against. When you give Patrick Mahomes no time to throw, as well as limit his improvisational activities, then you're truly able to shut down this Chiefs offense. Once again, it's in stark contrast to the Eagles offense, who, as I spoke about for almost 30 minutes now, they were the opposite of one-dimensional and able to have a good mix of the pass and the run, especially, opening up even more opportunities for this team. But the Chiefs start and end with the pass game. And Kareem Hunt and Pacheco are very solid running backs in their own right, but they are very far from the focal point of this offense. And so if you get to Mahomes, you set the tone for the entire game. And even not in terms of on-the-field play, obviously that's a big factor, but there's also a confidence aspect to it. Because if Mahomes is continually having to rush the ball out, that gets in his head a little bit, because this is someone who consistently has been the best quarterback in the league by most people's standards. And someone who is put on this pedestal as a guy who, by the end of his career, is going to challenge Tom Brady for the title of the greatest of all time. And so when you shut him down to where his only proper production comes when you rest your starters, that gets in his head a little bit. And as the game goes on, where these drives are continually stalling out and the Chiefs just can't put any points on the board, that plays into your mind a little bit when you are a superstar and someone that everyone is looking to complete a historic threepeat. That absolutely gets in your head. So not only do the linemen set the tone on the field, but they set the tone in the mind of the quarterback and this entire offense. But this incredible Philadelphia defense does not stop with the defensive linemen. We get to the linebackers, and you've got Zack Baun, who had the best season of any linebacker this year and was a finalist for Defensive Player of the Year. This was a man who was brought in on a 1-year deal, and he was a more than vital cog to this Philadelphia Eagles defense. And on the other end, Nakobe Dean, who was another very, very productive, impactful linebacker for this team, he went out with a season-ending injury. And that duo of him and Zack Baun was a very good duo the entire season for the Eagles. And I think we see it quite frequently. It's great to have one good linebacker, but to have two, that elevates your linebacking core to a completely different level. You look at the 49ers or even the Chiefs with their trio, that can be very important in elevating your defense to another level. And so with the loss of Nakobe Dean, I had a little bit of a growing concern for the Eagles, but Nolan Smith showed up very well in the absence of Nakobe Dean. Oh, and also, when I was talking about the pass rush, I don't know how I forgot to mention him. Shout out to Josh Sweat. In my opinion, the most valuable player in this game. He had 2.5 sacks and was the star of the show for that stellar Eagles pass rush. So you've got an elite pass rush. You have two great linebackers controlling the middle part of the field, and that leaves your defensive backs. And towards their collapse at the end of last season, this was a real issue for the Philadelphia Eagles. They would consistently lose games like to the Giants or the Cardinals, and then finally you are left with the defensive backs once you get past the linebackers in the pass rush. But towards that second half of the season, they just collapsed, and those losses that they took towards the end were due to just blown coverage after blown coverage and failure to just take someone down. And this was a secondary that was led by an aging Darius Slay, who is a great leader, has been a very impactful veteran, and a great player for so long, but he can't be the entire focal point of your secondary. And in the draft, they get both Cooper DeJean and Quinyon Mitchell. And all of a sudden, you're relying on Darius Slay just a little bit less. And now your secondary is more dynamic than ever because you're not having your aging veteran rely on him too much. And you let him have a little bit more of a limited role and allow the young guys to be able to keep up with some of the best receivers in the entire NFL as they did all year. And DeJean, in particular, the Super Bowl had not just an interception, not just a pick six, but the first pick of his entire career came in the biggest stage. So that secondary, in not relying too much on big play Slay anymore, just with age, right? As a corner especially, that's a position, much like the running back, that with age seems to decline drastically and kind of unexpectedly. Because you're expected to keep up with the best of the best wide receivers when you're CB1. And as you age, your body can't necessarily do that as well anymore. So to have him in a little bit lesser of a role and allow two other great cornerbacks to be added to the secondary, that's huge. And it's an uber well-rounded defense as well as one that has plenty of stars on it, especially Zack Baun, who I think if the Eagles are really looking to run it back and repeat, Zack Baun, re-signing him is of the utmost importance. As great as the offense for his team is, this defense puts them over the top and made them the truly uber impressive unit that they were. Before they rested their starters, they held the Chiefs to just 6 points. And from Hurts to Devonta Smith to Saquon Barkley to A.J. Brown to that entire offensive and defensive line to the rookie corners to Zack Baun to Brandon Graham going out with a Super Bowl victory perhaps. What a season it has been for the Philadelphia Eagles, and one that they will never forget. They had this one marked on their calendar ever since they lost to Kansas City a couple years ago. And they had one focus going into this year, not just win the Super Bowl, but stop the team that began their journey for a three-peat by defeating you, stopping that team from accomplishing and finishing the job. What a season it has been for the Philadelphia Eagles. And I hope that this was a pretty thorough breakdown of how they managed to win the Super Bowl. And that is all for today's episode of State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. Thank you for listening.